just going to talk today about the various types of texture that you can introduce into your mixed media work to give it a bit more interest. There's two main types of texture. There's visual texture and there's physical texture. So visible texture refers to things that appear to have texture. So I've got here just a couple of very plain pieces of paper, obviously not a lot of texture on them. But because I've used this dry brushing technique and layered with different colors and gone in different directions and gone over things, or in this case I've used dry brushing and then put a wash of phthalo blue on top of it, these pieces look like they have depth and they look like they have texture. You want to touch this. You want this texture to be experienced. So that will add a lot of interest to your paintings. If this was just like a broad slash of orange and then the magenta and the orange and the magenta, and it didn't have all these nice brush strokes in it that give it texture, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting to me. Another way of adding visual texture is with layering. So there is layering in both those collage pieces, particularly this one. I did just the brush strokes first, then I come back later and added some phthalo blue on. So that's what gives that. But the more layers you add, especially when you interlace layers of opacity and transparency, the more texture your painting is going to have. So this painting that I completed recently, a little bit hard because of the glare, but you can see there is a lot of visual texture going on here. It looks like this surface is sort of cracked and crazed and burnt, and it's called burnt offering, so I did intend that. And I did this by applying many layers, thin layers of transparencies, and then some opaque paints, and then glazing on top of that, and then putting gloss acrylic medium on, and then doing my next layer on top of that, so that there actually is, even though this is an extremely smooth surface, there actually is a lot of layers on this piece of paper. It is watercolor paper. You can also add visual texture, which can in part be physical. It kind of crosses the line by just, let's see if I can get this right. I'm trying to find it. There it is, see that X? So I just scratched into the wet paint when that came up. So that's sort of crossing the line between visual and physical texture. This painting also has physical texture in that I wanted to use some charcoal in the painting, but rather than drawing on with charcoal, I actually took a blade and I scraped the bits of charcoal onto the painting. So there's actual physical bits of charcoal embedded in some medium on the painting. So that's obviously a very heavily textured painting, both visually and physically. In terms of texture on a piece of paper, and I want to clarify about that in a minute, but this is fairly heavily textured in my view. If you are working on board or canvas, you can apply a lot more physical texture safely. So if you've got a surface that's flexible like the piece of paper, and you put something on it that is quite textured and very heavy, it can crack off. So you need to be careful about how you're applying your texture into what mediums. So this is a wood board, so nice sturdy thing, and I can put almost anything on this, as long as I have a medium or a glue that's strong enough to attach it and hold it on there. I can put almost anything on this piece of board. I've got some very sort of subtle physical texture with the collage, so I've left a hard edge of the collage there. I've got a piece of string embedded in here that gives me some texture just in this white area, just to make that a little bit more interesting. Now this series of paintings was done using collage from a book with some words and phrases, and when I ripped the book apart, this is actually the string that came out of the spine of the book, so I thought it was appropriate to include that in there. I've also used some coarse texture medium, which is basically like acrylic medium with, maybe the black will show better, with sand in it. I don't know if you can see the texture, I'm trying, but that's really gritty and rough. And you can either apply that directly to your painting and then paint on top of it, or you can mix paint with it, which is what I did in the case of this black bit. So you can do either one of those. And then once it's dry, if you notice the black has some little subtle white highlights on it. That's because I took a very, very small amount of white paint, or just off-white paint, and just went over the ridges but didn't get it into the coarse texture. So there's some nice textures in there. To add physical texture to your work, there's so many things you can do, starting with your very first layer of gesso. So when you put your gesso down, and this is white gesso, and there's some clear gesso here, and you can also get black gesso, or you can tint your gesso as well. When you put your gesso down, it gives you quite a bit of tooth, which means that if you've got a pencil or a charcoal or whatever, it will grab. So there's actually a very small amount of physical texture in gesso itself, as opposed to a gloss or a matte medium, which is very smooth. But if you put your gesso down thickly enough, you can carve into it, you can leave ridges, you can do all sorts of things to make texture in the painting before you even start to paint. You can also use what's called modeling paste or molding paste. Now this is just basically a very, very heavy medium. I'm going to show you how thick this stuff is. It's very thick. And it's like getting toothpaste back in the tube now, and I'm not going to be able to do it, so I'm just going to put that aside for a minute. So what you can do with the modeling paste is like the gesso, but even more extremely carve into it. So I'll just get some paper, maybe something with some color on it. So I've got this bit of collage paper here. I'll put some modeling paste on it. It doesn't take too much. And I'll just smooth that out with my little spatula here. But I can make a lot of texture there. That's the peak on that. It's really high, right? So again, I've just done this on a piece of paper. I would recommend being very careful using modeling paste on paper, because the paper is flexible and because the modeling paste will dry very rigid and very, it's not flexible at all. It might crack if you use it on paper. So you can, with caution, use modeling paste on paper in thinner layers. If you want it really thick, you're going to want to use a board. Canvas is kind of in between because the canvas can flex a lot in a frame, in a stretcher frame. So be careful of that. Canvas on board should be fine. That's rigid. Right, so you've got canvas on board. You can also take the modeling paste, I forgot to show you, oops, and push it through things. So you can be quite creative about what you actually use to make the texture in your painting. So here I've got a little stencil, and I can take some modeling paste and put it on top. Don't need much. And push that through the stencil. Now you can tell by my stencil that I'm not precious about what they look like and whether or not they have paint on them, but if you are, rinse it off right away. Okay, and that's given me some texture. You can also do something like this netting. Squeeze out a good amount there. Push that through the netting. I've used a double layer, so I don't know what's going to happen here. And that's part of the fun. Oh, and there's this really cool, really cool texture in that. I'm not a realistic painting, and I'm not sort of a fantasy painting, but right now I'm seeing like a mermaid's tail or some sort of reptile or something in there. So that's a great way to add some texture to your painting. And there's all sorts of things you can do. You could make a circle. You could push something in it to give it a circular form. Whatever you like, really. There's a circle in there now, and I've messed up my tube of paint, but I don't care. Okay, so there's that, and then this is the coarse texture medium. It's basically like medium with sand in it that I've used in this painting.